Hi, it's my pleasure to have Gayle Young as a guest, and Gayle is a good friend. She has worn a lot of different hats: a composer, performer, sound artist, um, editor of music works for many years. But what I'm mostly interested in this chat, she's also the author of a book on Hugh Le Caine, who is a pioneer of electronic music and synthesizers in particular from Canada. So it's my great pleasure to have Gail here, and let's start the conversation.
Thank
So,
you.
how did you learn about Hugh Le Caine? Like, I know about Hugh Le Caine because I first heard about him from you. What was your first encounter?
I knew some people who studied music at University of Toronto. In fact, they came up to Toronto to work with Le Cain's instruments. One of them was David Yeager, who for a long time
All right,
produced the new music show for CBC, Two New Hours, and
right.
his friend Larry Lake, James Montgomery. Um, so I was interested in electronic music, and they were one of the first bands that played live synthesizers in concert settings.
Mhm.
So I learned about him through them.
So, could we place that in time? Would that
Around 1977. And Le Caine
1977?
died in 1977. So then there
Okay,
was concern among the music community in Toronto. I'm not sure about the other parts of Canada, but in Toronto, people were concerned that his instruments would be lost, that somebody would take out a vacuum tube from one of them to fix another one, and then pretty soon there wouldn't be enough vacuum tubes to go around, etc.
right.
And
Yeah,
the other thing was, we didn't know what he built or how many. There was, we knew what was in the University of Toronto studio, but we didn't
right.
know what was anywhere else.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. A common thing with university setups is that somebody retires and then all this equipment that they carefully collected and maintained suddenly loses someone to take care of it, and then it lingers in a storage facility or nobody uses it. And so, okay, so what were the instruments that were there?
Well, that was what we had to find out.
Okay.
And that was the days of a program at Canada Council called Explorations, which was a wonderful program where people who were permitted to go outside of their areas of expertise. So I was a composer, a musician. I hadn't published any writing, but three of us, Larry Lake, Jim Montgomery, and I, got some funding to go around to all the studios we knew about and make a note of how many of what was there. And then we put out a little newsletter. So it was a photocopied newsletter. We made a little logo, and it was called the Hugh Le Caine Project Newsletter. We sent it out free to all the music libraries and all the music schools. And in the process of finding out what there was and where it was, and a basic description of what each instrument did,
Hmm.
people started telling us really interesting stories about Le
Right.
Caine, about the reception of Le Caine's instruments. He was a really interesting personality. And so I applied just myself without the other two participants. They were quite busy in other projects, to write a biography of Hugh Le Caine, again from Explorations.
Hmm.
It's a program that doesn't exist anymore, which is too bad.
Yeah, no,
Um,
that sounds like a really good idea.
yeah, because I wasn't a writer, but
Yeah.
I learned how to write. And I also had, because of the stories that were told by the
Mhm.
engineers that worked with him, the electronics technologists who saw him invent this and that, those stories were very interesting. And I became interested in oral history long before it was academically acceptable.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
Well,
the book
now
is,
it's almost like fashionable rather than acceptable. It's a hot
yeah,
topic. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, I sent a proposal for the book. When I got the first 3 or 4 chapters ready, I sent a proposal into
right.
U of T, thinking they'd be really interested, since U of T opened the first electronic music studio in Canada and the second one in North America. And they wrote
Right.
back and said there wasn't enough original writing. I had too many quotes.
Which again is quite common these days, but
Yeah, that's right.
um,
So I just went out of the academic system at that point.
right. So
Because
am I correct in assuming that basically he would build these instruments and then kind of populate these music centers, but it wasn't, you couldn't buy a Hugh Le Caine instrument at a store, or you couldn't, could you order one? Like it was not a, it was really mostly in academia, or am I wrong?
There were three instruments that almost got manufactured. The
Okay,
National Research Council, where he worked, first he worked in radar, first he worked in atomic physics, then he
right,
worked in radar during World War II, and then after World War II, he worked in microwave radio transmission and atomic physics. And all of those things have to do with waveforms.
right.
And he, throughout that whole period from when he was getting his graduate degrees at Queen's, he had a hobby of making instruments and playing them.
Hmm.
And so, especially during World War II, they would work long, long, long hours, and then they would go to the attic of the farmhouse where they were staying and jam all night on Huey's instruments. So
Nice.
there's lots of, I'm going to turn off my email. It just blinked at me.
No worries.
Okay, so I'll start that sentence again.
Yep.
Um, they used to jam all night after they worked on radar
Hmm.
during World War II, and the scientists and technicians knew that he built really interesting instruments. And it was in 1954, so almost 10 years after the war, that he completed the prototype sackbut. He'd had a keyboard instrument since the 30s. The
Hmm.
sackbut was unique in that it had continuous controls for pitch, volume, and wave shape.
Right,
And instruments since then, and even some before that, like the On Bartonneau, had some elements of that kind of control. But
right,
for the wave shape, he used capacitance. He
right,
had two plates. One on the bottom one, all the different waveforms were wired around the outside. The top one was mobile, and the closer it got to one of the waveforms that was wired in, the more like that waveform the sound became.
right. So it was kind of a mixing based on capacitance or selection of waveform
Yeah,
based.
but it was a fluid. It
It,
wasn't
it was
stepped.
continuous, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, so do we know whether, like, when I kind of first started learning about synthesizers, it's always the two American names that come up, Bob Moog and Don Buchla, that are hailed as kind of the innovators of analog synthesizers. Um, was there any influence? Did they know about his work? Do you know anything about connections between those three?
Yes, the person that ran the studio at University of Toronto from probably the mid 60s on, Gustav Chimaga, was a good friend of Bob Moog. And so
Okay,
he would come up to the studio and the three of them would talk. And
right,
so they knew each other.
cool,
And Le Caine published his material in scientific journals. It was freely available
right,
to researchers.
yeah. So, so let's, what are some of the ideas that sort of Le Caine pioneered? We talked about continuous control. What are some other things you think are interesting that sort of have found their way to more modern ideas?
I said a while ago that there were three instruments that almost got manufactured. One that he developed simultaneously with the sackbut in the 1960s was a touch-sensitive organ.
Right,
And underneath each key of the organ, there were five electrostatic sensors. And the further you push them down, the more power went to the volume controller.
right,
So he made a lot of interesting recordings, and he demonstrated it in conferences and trade shows. And Baldwin bought the patent for it. And so there was
right,
for a long time hope that it would be manufactured by Baldwin. But what
right.
the researchers in Ottawa told me was he had started from scratch in his design, and he didn't use any pre-existing components that Baldwin was already using. So in order to
Yeah,
manufacture it, they had to restructure their whole factory from the components on up, and it didn't happen.
right.
Everybody
Yeah.
was very disappointed about that.
Yeah. I mean that it's really interesting because we were just talking about the early history of FM synthesis and John Chowning, and it was a similar thing. He tried to pitch his ideas to a bunch of organ manufacturers in the US, and they were kind of interested, but they couldn't really figure out how to do it because of the components needed. And then Yamaha kind of like took interest, but they did a lot. It was a big gamble for them at the time. It ended up paying handsomely, but they it was a very like trying to convince these companies to take on a completely new way of doing things
Yeah.
was hard.
Yeah.
So, what was something that I'm curious is what was his? Did he have any music training? Uh, in
Yes, he was an excellent musician. When he finished high
Okay.
school in the Depression, he had to choose between science and music.
Oh, great. Okay. So,
Yeah.
and he was a pianist mostly,
He was
or
a pianist. He also played violin.
oh, he also played violin. So that's
Yeah.
because one of the things that I've always been, it's sort of, for lack of a better term, it seems like his work is always permeated with more continuous expression. So instead of discrete, he very much it's like about sound control and touch and expressivity, which are sort of kind of the piano is maybe the least capable instrument of controlling those things compared to something like a violin. So that's really interesting. I didn't know that he played the violin. Um, so
It could indicate that he loved the polyphony of the piano, but he also loved the detailed control of the violin, and that
right,
could be what attracted him to building
yeah,
instruments.
yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because kind of now it's almost there's a bit of a resurgence into this idea of very continuous keyboards that have individual touch controls and you can bend pitches in between the keys and there's a couple of them coming out. So I find that quite interesting. So let's talk a little bit. I think I will probably play some to the students in class. Let's talk about Dripsody.
Okay, that's instrument number 3.
Right,
So in the early 50s, Le Caine was sent to University of Birmingham to become a PhD in atomic physics. And he lived there in the post-war conditions with the rationed food and very little opportunity to travel.
right.
But while he was there, he heard the BBC broadcasts of the Musique Concrète School from Paris. And he
Oh,
was
okay.
very excited about it
Right,
and began to think about making a series of parallel playback systems for 1/4-inch magnetic tape. And so that's how he made Dipsody in 1955. Um, he he constructed several tape loops,
hmm,
um, and he had a keyboard. So what happens on keyboard is if you play an octave, you get twice the number of vibrations per second. The same thing happens with tape. If you play it twice as fast, it goes up an octave.
right. So the keys control the playback speed.
That's it.
Also.
Yeah, he managed to use voltage control to control the playback speed of
Mhm.
6 simultaneous reels of tape, but they weren't really reels, they were great big loops for Dipsody.
That's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's so it was essentially it was kind of performed rather than stitched together.
I think it would have made a fantastic performance if anybody had brought it on stage.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very cool. So
yeah.
just, I mean, I'm not sure everybody who's listening to this knows Dripsody. Dripsody is a piece that is constructed from one short recording of a droplet of water, and that source material is kind of used in many different ways to create textures and different variations in pitch and dynamics. And it's kind of a modern sounding piece. Like it's still, you know, you wouldn't think that it was created when it was created. It kind of sounds like it comes from the future of the time.
Well,
So,
what happened in the 50s was people were getting into very extreme modernist music, 12-tone music, extremely
right,
dissonant music. Le Caine really liked comprehensible, tonal, and
yeah,
humorous music. Um,
right. So
he was
that's
from Thunder Bay, after all.
Right. So that's yeah. So that's another thing. He definitely had a pretty quirky sense of humor. Can you tell us any examples or stories for that?
Um, well, the audio kind of speaks for itself. Um,
Yeah.
a piece called Arcane Creates Lulu. I should correct the title of that. Um, it's the scream from the end of the opera Lulu by Berg, but
Right.
he puts it on the playback and it goes and sings Happy Birthday with the scream, and then eventually gives up in desperation and frustration, and there's this long drawn out scream at the end. That's an example of humor.
Right. Yeah. So he definitely, yeah, he kind of there's a very different, a very, I would say almost Canadian vibe to how he approached these things. Let's say in contrast to someone like Boulez or the more European composers who experimented with that stuff that were very capable and extremely did a very interesting stuff, but they took themselves very, very seriously. Like there's no self-deprecating humor or
No.
kind of that thing. So I think that's pretty cool. Um, so what's the Le Caine project at the Science Museum in Ottawa? Oh, hey, good to see you.
Um, one result of the research that we did in the uh, 80s, finding out what existed and where it was that when the universities stopped using the stuff and realized that this stuff takes up 3 square meters of our studio, where are we going to go to put it? Um, by that time, I had created a connection with the Science Museum because they inherited some of the stuff directly from the NRC lab. So they already
Mhm.
had a collection and they wanted more stuff. So I put people who ran the studios in touch with the museum, and they have a very interesting collection. Almost everything was donated to their collection. It's in a very large warehouse now. It's not on public display. Well, some instruments are on public display.
Right.
So how would you go about making an exhibition of something of so many instruments that were that big? And in some cases, there were 3 versions of each instrument, and they're all significantly different from
Yeah.
each other. Um, So one of the crucial innovations, we already spoke about continuous voltage control
Yeah.
and how it pervaded a lot of Le Caine's instruments. Um, do you know Bill Buxton?
Yeah. I do know Bill Buxton.
Bill Buxton believes that the sackbut touch-sensitive control was a very important step towards the touchscreen.
Right.
Of course,
Yeah.
capacitance have been around for a long, long, long time, but
Yeah.
Le Caine's plate against plate
Yeah.
contact
Yeah.
he thinks was a big jump. And he has this article called The Long Tail of Innovation, where he kind of implies it.
Yeah.
But he spoke to me personally, saying that he thinks that the sackbut keyboard, the sackbut timbre controller, is a significant precursor. And the museum was planning to have a parallel exhibit of the sackbut and the 20th anniversary of the iPhone, making
Right.
the connection.
Um, Great. So, yeah, I mean, and the other thing that's kind of, for many of the older synthesizers, it's relatively straightforward. Even analog synthesizers these days, it's relatively straightforward to create software emulations of the sound generation process because their control was relatively simple. Like it's a discrete keyboard, maybe some dials, maybe some buttons. So it's you can get a pretty close, I guess, approximation to what they sound and play them with just a MIDI controller and some software running on a modern laptop. But with Hugh Le Caine's instruments, because so much of the, let's say, analog nature of them was in the actual control, it's much harder. It would require sort of getting more into the hardware. The other thing I wanted to mention is for Bill Buxton is I don't know how many people listening to this know who he is, but he has done a lot of pioneering work and continues to do in human-computer interaction, a lot of fundamental work in touchscreens and control. But he started some of his early work was on early computer systems for entering music notation, and he has always had a kind of really strong interest in music and that side
Yeah,
of.
it was called the Structured Sound Synthesis Project.
Yeah, the structure
And
sound.
I was a volunteer
Oh,
composer.
right.
We had meetings with lots of interesting grad students in electronics and digital technology, and they would come up with an idea and say, as a composer, how does this fit with how you think sound works? And then we
Right.
would talk about it, and we did that every week for 2 or 3 years.
That's fantastic. I didn't know that. That's really cool. Yeah,
And I wrote a piece for my stringed instruments and Bill playing. He was one of the first people that had a portable digital synthesizer.
right.
So we played concerts at one in St. Catharines, which is a pretty small town in Ontario. And so I would bring the string instrument and we played the piece. It was great.
Wow,
But
I didn't know that connection. I actually remember reading about it when I was first started being interested in computer music, and I think seeing some pictures and reading about different ways of entering music notes. So sort of they were looking into that. Um, that's yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and the whole, I mean, I recently have been thinking a lot and looking into the history of keyboards, both musical and like regular keyboards, the ones we use.
yeah,
And there's no way to prove that, but I think a very strong case can be made that the idea of a keyboard came first from music. And
yeah,
then, people had seen organs and pianos and harpsichords, and they were like, okay, if somebody, and interestingly enough, it was initially more for accessibility, like someone who could not use a pen, maybe they can press buttons and type letters as a slow way of writing. And,
yeah, yeah,
and then kind of, we started having typewriters, and that led to computer keyboards eventually. But we're spending millions of people are typing on their keyboards, whether they're phone keyboards or computer keyboards, every day. Or
yeah,
everything you read on the internet is typed on somebody's keyboard, and all that originates back to sort of music keyboards. So I find that
yeah,
quite fascinating. All right.
yeah,
So, um, so the other thing, one thing that I'm pretty impressed, especially like in the context of what you were just saying with the computer science department thinking that that was not computer science work, and the music department thinking that that was not music work for Bill
yeah,
Buxton, I find the fact that the NRC said, okay, we have this great engineer who is doing these measurement devices for physics and atomic stuff, and he's doing this weird instrument stuff. We're gonna pay him full time to do this. I'm really impressed by that
yeah,
for that time. So,
yeah.
um, do you have any information? Like, what is it? Just that they just thought it's cool? How anything more about that?
There are two, I have two parallel responses. The first one is he had built up a very strong loyalty among everybody at NRC. There
Right,
was there was an extreme sense of community coherence.
mhm,
Um, the other physicists played his instruments at parties. They recorded them. A lot of them went up to Chalk River afterwards and then came back down to Ottawa to jam occasionally.
I
Um,
see.
and the second thing is the mandate of National Research Council was and is, but it seemed to be primarily was in this, I remember it as the 1950s mandate, of course, because that's what I was researching,
Right,
to come up with ideas that would stimulate the manufacturing industry in Canada in the post-war world.
right,
Because there was a lot of resources, there were a lot of unemployed service people, most of whom had got degrees at U of T or McGill or something as part of their
Right.
ex-service benefits. And there weren't very many jobs for them. And it would be really nice if we got some factories going so these people could,
Yeah.
contribute to the post-war economic boom. And because Le Caine's playing of his own instruments was so popular and so party-oriented, everybody who knew him said, these would be a hit. Everybody's going to want one.
I see. Yeah.
But yeah, and they would have been if they could have manufactured it. But the hurdles that we've already spoken about
Yeah.
the radical difference in how you get the sound to come out is
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I never, somehow it always seemed very academic, but I can see that, the people who were familiar with it, they were like, this is fun stuff to play with.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And they thought it had commercial potential, and I think it would have had
Yeah.
commercial potential. But at one point, one of the really good friends of Le Caine, he had, even when I talked to him, which was in the 70s, I mean the 80s, early 80s, he still had incredible loyalty among everybody who worked with. And so the
Right.
guy said to turn off that cassette recorder and I'll tell you what really happened, because
Hmm.
he didn't want it on record.
Right.
He said, Baldwin, a lot of people here at NRC think Baldwin bought that patent to prevent anybody else from making an organ that would compete with Baldwin.
Right. Yeah, that's another, common
Yeah,
way.
so now that's oral history. So I did turn off the tape recorder, but I didn't turn off my memory. So
Yeah, yeah, no, it's yeah, and a lot of these things also it's just timing and it's being an innovator many times means that you also are ahead of your time. Like
yeah, yeah,
your ideas come out at a time when before kind of the industry is ready to necessarily take them on. So who knows? Like it could have gone completely different if someone else was involved and things like it could have changed. And he did have he could have continued working for. How old was he when he died in the accident? I think he was mid 60s or
yeah.
yeah. So he probably had another 5, 10 years of possible interesting work that we lost. Do you know what projects he was working on near the end of his life?
No,
No. Okay.
I think he might have been very discouraged about music, like Bill Buxton, and for
Right.
similar reasons.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So yeah, I think that's all I
Well,
have.
he only to give that some context, he retired in 71, 72. I have to look that up.
Right.
And he died in 74. He didn't have much time to pick up a second career.
Oh, right. So yeah, okay, I see. Yeah. So it's interesting. I also, uh, there's almost
I'll get you the dates right now. I've got them on a CD. It's right over here.
okay.
I'll have to give you the dates for sure later.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to know when he retired and how much time it was in the context of
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. And those, I was just looking at my notes. The one thing that I was wanted to talk a little bit about, which I thought was quite interesting, is that his also part of his design philosophy was to make these instruments kind of modular, so they connect one instrument connected to the other instrument, but it's a
Yeah.
very different concept of modularity than the classic analog synthesizer where you have all the patch cords. It's
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it, but I find that quite fascinating.
Well,
The,
we haven't talked about the third instrument that almost got
oh, right,
manufactured.
yeah.
Was the multi-track where he did Dripsody and
Mhm.
Arcane Presents Lulu, etc. It was an example of this, what you're speaking of, because he had a keyboard that was touch sensitive that would control the pitch. And he used the keyboard for the multi-track. And that was a crossover
Mhm.
to control the pitch to control the rotation speed of the capstan through voltage control.
Right.
So it was in terms of conceptual electronics, it was very similar, but in terms of the practical operations, it was completely different.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's also um, sort of leveraging this modality that, we're used to playing keyboards and controlling them with our fingers, but in a sort of to control something that typically you would use a slider or you would use something else, and
yeah,
that's
yeah,
because the keyboard was touch sensitive.
yeah.
So, so is there anything else? Did I miss anything? Like in a quick conversation about Hugh Le Caine? Um, Obviously, if people want to find out more, they can read your book, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there.
Yeah. Hmm.
That's fine. I think
Yeah, we can catch up again later.
yeah,
Especially if something happens to you, I don't mind setting up another Zoom call.
yeah, no, I think it's good. We
Yeah,
covered quite a bit of ground, so that's awesome.
yeah.
Um, Good. All right. So,
Okay,
yeah, so let me know if you and Reiner come out here at any point.
sure.
Um, there is a small chance I will be coming by Toronto at some point, but nothing concrete at the moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and good. All right.
Okay.
Great
It was
talking
been
to
fun
you.
talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yeah, okay.
Bye.
Bye.